Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last session of Introduction to Latin America and the Caribbean 1. And today we're mostly dealing with the first years of the 19th century, like 1800 to 1820. And our main topic of discussion is this transition from empire to independence, right? Like, how did the colonial period in Latin America and the Caribbean end? How these 300 plus years of colonial rule in the region, with presence of the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the English, and many others, ended? And what kind of society was born out of this transition from empire to independence? And also, I wanted to just remind you, like the situation of like crisis and economic transformation that the region was going through that we discussed in the last session. We saw a deterioration of trade, right? A deterioration and transformation of trade. We saw what happened with silver, what happens with gold, and the kind of implication that had in on the relationship between Latin America and the Caribbean and the European empires, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese. But also, we discussed the situation of these empires themselves. The Spanish Empire, by the beginning of the 19th century, it was an empire in decay, right? It didn't have the power it used to have in the 17th, in the 16th century, right? The most powerful empire on earth. Now that place was given to the British. And remember, as I told you, the British Empire was actually an industrial empire. Like Britain itself was going through the Industrial Revolution that wasn't happening in Portugal or in Spain. And that's going to transform also the trade. On the one hand, the markets of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas didn't have many products from Spain and Portugal because they were not industrial empires at the moment, but they were full of British and other foreign goods, right? Like, so you have incoming British goods coming to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas. But on the other hand, you also have an intention on behalf of the British Empire to break the monopoly of trade between Europe and America that Spain and Portugal had, right? So if Britain wanted to trade with Mexico, for instance, what was back then the Vice Kingdom of New Spain, they had to trade first with Spain and then through Spain with Mexico. And they wanted to do that directly, like avoiding the middleman, which in this case was the Spanish Empire. And that's why also, as we are going to see, the British funded many of the independence movement in Latin America, right? They provided money, they provided guns, and many other things needed to fight against the Spanish and the Portuguese. But even if we have a critical situation, right, the economic crisis that we mentioned, the transformation of trade, the decay of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, the independence of the Latin American and Caribbean colonies from the Spanish and Portuguese empire wouldn't have been possible without Napoleon. Remember, we talked last session about the French Revolution, the beheading of the king, the abolition of the monarchy, right? There was initially a transformation inside France, but with Napoleon, who actually at some point declared himself the emperor of France, this is going to expand to other European countries in what's called today the Napoleonic Wars, right? Which is basically Napoleon and his army, the French invading other countries in Europe. And the decisions he makes in these first decades of the 19th century are going to have a gigantic impact in Latin America and the Caribbean. Without those invasions, the independence wouldn't have been possible. So basically, remember that the revolution, French Revolution happens, but then the Haitian Revolution also happens, like very shortly after. And with the Haitian Revolution, the French Empire loses one third of its foreign trade, like its most profitable, its wealthiest colony ends up in the hands of the people they had enslaved. So they lost quite a lot of money, and what Napoleon wanted to was to recover that. Like as I told you last session, like the French first tried to invade Haiti and they failed, right? So what Napoleon does is first he invades Portugal in 1807, with the idea of getting control of Brazil, right? And the sugar coming from Brazil to Europe. And then 1 year after, in 1808, he invades Spain with the idea of getting control of the colonies in the Americas as well. And it's this invasion of these two countries that's going to mark the beginning of the independence process. When Napoleon invades Portugal, right, in 1807, the King of Portugal actually manages to leave Portugal before Napoleon arrives. So what he's going to do, the King of Portugal, he's going to move from Portugal to Brazil, and Rio de Janeiro becomes the new imperial capital. The entire court, the imperial court, is moved with the king to Rio de Janeiro, and then you have the king himself governing his empire from Brazil. So remember that the intention of Napoleon was actually to get control of Brazil, but the decision of the Portuguese king to go to Brazil took this option out of Napoleon's hands. So that's when he decides to invade Spain 1 year later in 1808. But in this case, he manages to capture the king, and it's this capturing of the king that is going to trigger the independence movements in Latin America and the Caribbean. Remember, we are talking about a monarchical system. And in a monarchical system, all legitimacy and the exercise of political power comes from the king himself, right? It's the king that provides legitimacy to the viceroys that we discussed a couple of sessions ago, and all the colonial bureaucracy in Latin America and the Caribbean. But without the king, what happens is that this creates a vacuum of power. There is no source of legitimate power. So what many people in Latin America and the Caribbean are going to say is like, why do we have to obey the viceroy if the viceroy is supposed to govern in the name of the king? But the king was captured by Napoleon, right? So the situation is going to be, and we're going to see that in a minute, that for Portuguese America and Spanish America, the situation is going to be very different. For Spanish America, the colonies are farther away from the king than they've ever been since 1492 and the arrival of the Spanish to the region. But in the case of Portugal, the Portuguese America, right? The Portuguese king is closer than ever to the colonies, right? He's living in the colonies while the Spanish king is captured, and it's going to mark two very different paths toward independence in the 19th century for the Portuguese possessions and the Spanish possessions. So let's see what happens. Let's see first what happens in the case of Spanish America. The main characteristic of independence process in Spanish America is that it's achieved through war, right? You're going to have wars of independence against the Spanish Empire. And the first war is going to be born out of a very particular social legal classification that existed in the Spanish Empire in Latin America at the moment, that I mentioned a couple of sessions earlier, and it's the difference between peninsulars and Creoles, right? Peninsulars, remember, are people of the Spanish descent who were born in Spain and then they traveled to the Americas. While Creoles, they're also of Spanish ancestry, their father and their mother are Spanish, right? But they're born in the Americas, and because they're born in the Americas, they don't have access to the higher hierarchies of political and religious power. For instance, the viceroy had to be born in Spain, and the first people who are going to go to war are precisely the Creoles. Like many of the independence war in the wars of independence, leaders like Simon Bolivar or San Martin, right, Belgrano, all of these guys, they were Creoles themselves, right? They were the children of Spanish settlers. And they're going to war against the people who were trying to uphold the political system in the region. And that's why how it's end up being called is you have the conflict between the loyalists, the people loyal to the Spanish crown, and the insurrectionists. And as I mentioned, most of the insurrectionist leaders are going to be Creoles. And then you have like some important battles like that in Boyacá, what was back then the Vice Kingdom of New Granada, today Colombia in 1819, right? Very similar numbers in terms of their army, to 2,720 to 2,800. And the largest battle was Ayacucho, and also the last one in 1824, after which the last viceroy is expelled from the Americas, where you have roughly 9,300 against 6,000. So let's talk about the American leaders. Like the one you see, the guy you see in this picture, this is Bolivar, right? And other people like San Martin, Belgrano that I mentioned, like they were the leaders of the insurrection, the leaders of the independence movements, the leaders of the war, right? And they came from a range of occupations and social backgrounds, but the most important leaders were Creoles, right? They were the children of like they had a Spanish ancestry, like their parents were Spanish. And this is very important just to understand what changes and what doesn't change with independence. So, of course, what's going to change first and foremost is the political system. We go from like colonies that are part of a monarchy to um, countries that are organized as republics, from monarchy to republic. That's the most important transition that takes place because of independence. But that doesn't mean that the economic system, that the cultural representation, that the social backgrounds are going to change. People like Bolivar, for instance, come from a slaveholder family. So, of course, the abolition of slavery or the fights for equality on behalf of the indigenous communities, they were not the most important part of these independence wars. Like the most important part was to create a political system in which the Creoles actually held most of the power and not the peninsulars. We had some cases in which you're going to have mestizo insurgents. And this is very interesting because you can see also how other groups started to revolt against the Spanish Empire, but also against the Creoles. So people like Morelos, for instance, in Mexico, he was a priest, but he was a mestizo, a mixed race descent person, right? And what he's going to say is very interesting because what he says is the war against the Spanish Empire has to turn into a social war against slaveholders, against landowners, right? Like he's introducing a social class component to this. It's not just about expelling the Europeans. It's about transforming the economic system, the social system, right? The political system among the people who were born in the Americas. We have to abolish slavery. We have to abolish Indian tribute, right? We have to redistribute land. And as we will see by the end of today's session, like many of these demands were defeated, right? Were defeated. So the project that ends up winning in the independence is a project, championed by these Creole leaders like Bolivar, San Martin, and Belgrano. So remember that Napoleon captured the Spanish king in 1808, right? So it's a very long process, almost 20 years of different wars, battles, political campaigns, military campaigns over the future of the American colonies. But the final campaigns, the most important military campaigns, like led by Belgrano, San Martin, Bolivar, that I was mentioning, are going to happen roughly between 1819 and 1825. San Martin, who liberated the southern cone, like Argentina, Chile, like that part, he took Lima in 1821. Lima was the last stronghold of the Royalists to people loyal to the Spanish Empire. Remember the capital of Peru, but he was unable to establish like his authority in the entire vice kingdom. It is only going to happen with the Battle of Ayacucho in Peru in 1824 that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. It becomes the beginning of the end, right, of colonial rule, because by 1826 the last royalist base in South America, which is like around what today is Peru and Bolivia, surrendered, and the last viceroy was expelled from from the continent and had to go back to Spain, right? So it's in this conjunction of economic crisis and the Napoleonic Wars that the space of possibility to change the future of the American colonies shows up, emerges, and it happens in the form of a war in the case of Spanish America. But as I was telling you, the situation in Brazil, in Portuguese America, is very different because the king of Portugal, decides to remain in Brazil and, and elevates, right, the status of Brazil to that of a kingdom. It's not anymore a colony to the Portuguese Empire, right? It's a kingdom itself, part of the Portuguese crown. And the fact, right, the fact that the Portuguese king came to Brazil means that in Brazil, in Portuguese America, there was no civil war. So that's the big difference. And that's going to mark like many of the discussions that we can have about the 19th century. Because as while countries like Colombia or Mexico and Bolivia started the 19th century, their independent life as republics virtually destroyed, right? Because of the war. In the case of Brazil, there was no war at all. If you look at the map of South America, Brazil is the largest country by surface, and the area of Brazil is so big because there was no civil war. Like the entire Portuguese colony turns into Brazil. So what happens here is the king, as I was telling you, flees from Lisbon, goes to Brazil, stays in Brazil, originating particularly for many years. In 1821, after Napoleon is defeated in Europe, he goes back to Portugal, right? But he leaves his son, the prince, to rule Brazil, and is the son of the king that's going to declare the independence of Brazil from the Portuguese Empire, and he becomes an emperor, right? So for most of the 19th century, Brazil is actually going to be an empire, the empire of Brazil, like officially. And precisely because of that is also that Brazil is one of the last countries to abolish slavery. Just in the 1880s, the last two countries are Brazil and Cuba. Like, but sugar production was important. Cuba itself remained, as we are going to see in a minute, a colony belonging to Spain, right? So just to finish this comparison, just keep in mind how different the process was in Brazil and it was in the rest of Latin America. How it was different in the case of Portuguese America and Spanish America, because in Spanish America, there was a war against the Spanish crown, while in Portuguese America, it was the Prince of Portugal who declares the independence from the Portuguese Empire. So the Spanish Empire disappears as such in Latin America. The Portuguese Empire disappears as such, right? It's replaced by the Empire of Brazil, and the Spanish as America's possession are replaced by all the countries we know today. Some countries broke down into like smaller pieces, like the Vice Kingdom of New Granada, for instance, becomes the Great Colombia, that is later further divided into what today is Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama, right? But then in 1826, after the last loyalist base in South America is defeated and the last viceroy has to go back to Spain, the Spanish crown, right? The Spanish Empire, once one of the mightiest empires on earth, only retains Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as its colonies, right? Like that's all that it's left. And Cuba was economically and fiscally the most important possession because of because of the sugar industry, right? Remember that what happens in the last decade of the 19th century is the Haitian Revolution, and with the Haitian Revolution comes the destruction of the sugar economy on the island, the part of the island that is today Haiti. And Haiti at that moment, right before the revolution, was the place where most of the sugar that was consumed in Europe was produced, right? Most of the sugar was coming from Haiti. And after the revolution, that road moved to Cuba, which is actually physically close. Like at some parts of Cuba, in a clear day, you can see Haiti some kilometers away. So Cuba becomes what they called back then the sugar bowl of the world. Like most of the sugar was produced in Cuba. So the Cuban elites, right, the Cuban Creoles, the Cuban Peninsulars, they were not interested in a civil war. They were not interested in a war against the Spanish Empire because they knew a war against the Spanish Empire might very fast and easily become a war against themselves, becomes a war against slavery, and they didn't want slavery to end, right? So again, Cuba is one of the last countries to abolish slavery. It only abolishes slavery in the 1880s. So 60 years after the end of Spanish rule in most of Latin America. And then, of course, there is a war at some point in Cuba, but the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines is very different because at the end of the 19th century, what you're going to have is the Spanish-American War, the war between the United States and Spain. And the result of this war is that the United States takes over Cuba and Puerto Rico. So Cuba and Puerto Rico don't become independent because they go from one colonial overseer to another colonial overseer. They come from being a Spanish colony and they become an American colony, colony of the United States. Of course, Cuba in 1959, like way later than the period covered in this class, but in 1959, like they win a revolution and they expel like all the influence of the United States, with the exception of one part, which is Guantanamo, the Guantanamo base. Infamously, it's still in the hands of the United States. But Puerto Rico, there was not it's like social war against like U.S. presence, and it's still a colony of the United States. So with this, we close our discussion of the colonial period. You can see how the Spanish Empire disappears, the Portuguese Empire disappears, but that doesn't mean that there is not still like a presence of these colonial relations in Latin America, right? Or like just keep in mind like the big important transformation transition taking place is that of from like coming from a monarchy and going to a republic, right? From a monarchical system to a republican system. That's a big transformation, but there's not big transformation in the economy, for instance. Take many years to abolish slavery, take many years to abolish Indian tribute, it takes many years to um, redistribute the land. And in many cases, that only happens because of new revolutions, right? The Mexican Revolution in the first decades of the 20th century is going to accomplish many of the things that the independence wars in the 19th century didn't get to do. So with this, we close our discussion, and that pretty much give us like, you know, all of these historical arc that comes from 1492 when Christopher Columbus arrives, all the way to 1826 when the last viceroy of Spain leaves the region and all the countries become independent from colonial rule.